GURPS. If there was a tabletop role-playing game that was super pervasive and defined the 90s role-playing game scene, it would be Steve Jackson's generic universal role-playing game system. This is perhaps the most well-known of all generic role-playing games, and it has a rule for just about every possible thing you could want, as well as a splat book for every possible subject you could imagine. Hero System may be my generic game of choice, but I can't knock GURPS. It's easily earned its place in the role-playing game canon. There's a lot of GURPS setting books out there, and some of the RPG books I've dreamed of finding one day include some of the Japan-only GURPS splat books, like GURPS Renal. So, with all that said, let's actually take a peek into the core rulebook for GURPS 4th edition and see what makes it tick, shall we? GURPS is an interesting beast as far as role-playing games go. You know how everybody says Dungeons & Dragons is a great game because you can, and I quote, do anything in it? Steve Jackson probably heard this, took it as a challenge, and said, hold my beer. GURPS 4th edition is split into two core rulebooks, characters and campaigns, and the titles of them are self-explanatory. Characters has character creation and a few basic rules, while campaigns has all the other good stuff you may or may not actually use. We're first going to be covering the characters book, since none of the other rules matter if you don't have a character. My initial expectations of GURPS was that it would be similar to Hero. This was a misguided assumption. GURPS and Hero are both very detailed games with a lot of optional rules and splat that can be mixed, matched, and tweaked to your liking. The devil is in the details, or so I've been told, and the details are: Hero has a generic set of core rules that are built to represent different things. Meanwhile, GURPS is a set of core rules, and I would dare say an infinitely expanding catalog of optional rules. Because as of writing this particular passage, the latest announcement from the GURPS webpage shows that Steve Jackson Games is still publishing new material for 4th edition. So, with that said, I'm going to start off with this. If you really want to get into GURPS, brace yourself for a lot of reading. There is a lot of material. Because the latest edition has been around since 2004. That's 18 years Steve Jackson and company have had to write new books. But for your first step, I suggest starting with GURPS Lite. It gives you the most important core rules first and weighs in at 32 pages. That's basically a pleasant night of reading. You can add more rules from the core book as you see fit later. It's really best to treat the full version of GURPS like an encyclopedia. You don't need to use every rule printed in the book, but they're present for if you need them. With that said, if you're feeling brave, then let's dig in and start with the characters book. There are 3 roles that are the backbone of GURPS: success, reaction, and damage. Success rolls are the most common of all. You roll 3 6-sided dice and check if the total is less than or equal to your target number. This is usually one of your stats or skills. A modifier can be applied to this target number to make it more difficult or easy. For example, a roll against Science -2 would need to be 2 less than your science skill just to pass. Also, the more you beat your target number by, the better you've succeeded. That is, getting a 10 when your target number was 13 is better than getting a 13. Reaction rolls are less common, and they're meant for the GM more than for the players. It's when the GM rolls 3 dice and consults a table to see how an NPC reacts to a player character. This is one of the instances where a high roll is better for the players, since a higher reaction roll typically means that NPCs react more favorably to the player character. The charts for this are found in the campaign book. And for damage rolls, if you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons, you already know how this works. But for the improbable but possible of you whomst have somehow come into the world of tabletop role-playing games through literally anything other than D&D, it's quite simple. In GURPS, damage rolls are a certain number of dice, with a certain number added to the total of all the dice. For example, 2d6 minus 1 would be rolling 2 dice, adding them together, and subtracting 1. These core rules are the backbone of pretty much everything in GURPS, and they have different situations where both high numbers and low numbers are favorable. Perfect for players convinced that their dice are skewed in one way or the other. GURPS is a point-buy game. You get so many points, and literally every detail about your character costs a certain amount of these points. You typically start with anywhere from 100 to 200, depending on how powerful the game master wants your characters to be. Concept is key. GURPS, like many other point-buy systems, is very open-ended. Without any idea of what you want to play, you're going to have a difficult time making your character. Your concept can be as broad or as narrow as you like, so long as you can fall back onto it to help you guide your decisions, and it's also not completely out of line with what the GM wants. If the GM says that they want to run a game that's about paranormal mystery and it's set in Taisho-era Japan, playing as a warrior king of Chimeria from Hyborian age is liable to be vetoed if the GM doesn't want their game to get too wacky. Additionally, GMs may offer templates for players to start their characters, which is useful for those more accustomed to games like Dungeons & Dragons, where one class choice determines pretty much everything about your character. I'll go over templates more when covering the campaigns book. For now though, we're going to go over the attributes used in GURPS. At its core, GURPS is simple. There's 4 main attributes: strength, dexterity, IQ, and health. And these typically range anywhere from 8 to 12 for most humans, with 10 being completely average. In practical terms, for most rolls, you'll be aiming to roll beneath these numbers for checks pertaining to it. So if you've got 12 health, and you're rolling to see if you can withstand getting sick from drinking something out of a vessel that was improperly cleaned with bleach, you'll roll 3d6 and you want to get 12 or less. And if you don't get 12 or less, your character is going to be puking their guts out because the bottle wasn't rinsed well enough. Primary attributes are costly, but for good reason. They influence several other secondary attributes. Strength affects how much damage you deal, how much you can lift, as well as how much HP you have. You can also spend points to increase HP on its own if you don't want to have a particularly high strength. And thus, by default, your HP is equal to your strength. Dexterity influences speed and movement, both of which can be individually increased as well. Movement also has a lot of caveats meant for different environments, like being in water or in space. IQ has the secondary attributes of willpower and perception, withstanding psychological attacks, and noticing things, respectively. They can be increased individually as well. The default rating for willpower and perception is equal to your IQ. Health affects speed as well as fatigue. Fatigue is used to measure how much strenuous activity a character can engage in, and like many other secondary attributes, it can be bought separately. By default, fatigue is equal to your health. I'd also like to take a moment to point out that speed is a strange secondary attribute. It's influenced by 2 main attributes and further influences other secondary attributes such as movement and dodge. Speed is equal to your health and your dexterity added together, divided by 4, and not rounded. This is because a speed of 5.25 is better than 5, and that speed is bought in quantities of 0.25. So you can bring your fractional speed up to a whole number if you're so inclined. Dodge is equal to your speed plus 3, always rounded down, making this one of the reasons you may want to buy partial speed. And your movement is equal to your speed, rounded down. For example, since this is one of the more funky aspects of GURPS, say you have 12 dexterity and 14 health. Add them together and you get 26. Divide by 4 and you have a speed of 6.5. This would grant this character a dodge of 9, since 6.5 plus 3 is 9.5, and it rounds down to 9. Meanwhile, their movement would be 6 for much the same reason. 6.5 rounds down to 6. But one way we could feasibly cheese this character is by bringing their base speed up to 7 by buying that last 0.5, resulting in 10 dodge and 7 movement. There's honestly a lot of attributes to consider when making a character than the ones described here, but this is the basics. GURPS is incredibly granular, but you don't need to use everything to get an enjoyable experience with it. For that reason, I'll cover the more specific attributes in a separate video. The advantages and disadvantages sections are the meat of GURPS' character creation book. Any sort of unusual thing a human could or could not do, for good or ill, can be found in these 2 sections. Folks familiar with Big Eye Small Mouth may feel at home here, since one of the writers for GURPS was contracted to help out with Besm early on. This section also includes the modifiers section, ways to make certain advantages better at a higher cost, or to make them less effective for a discount. Thus, hero players might also feel at home here. Much like how almost anything can be bought in Hero with power modifiers, almost anything in GURPS can have modifiers attached to it. Whatever your personal background, you're likely to spend a lot of time in this section. Luckily, in the back of the character's book is a list of all the advantages, disadvantages, and modifiers. This in addition to there being a few visual cues the book gives you for if you prefer to just skim through sections. There's a few icons that give a quick insight into the nature of the different advantages and disadvantages. The first such set is icons that show whether an advantage or disadvantage is physical, mental, or social. The second set shows if it is exotic, supernatural, or mundane, with mundane being indicated with neither of these icons. Mundane is available to just about anybody, while an exotic advantage or disadvantage is usually the result of something that makes a character not human, things like having mechanical parts in their body or being a cold-blooded creature like a lizard. In other words, they have a rational explanation and will likely require GM permission. You cannot pick cold-blooded if the GM is not allowing lizard people as player characters. Supernatural, on the other hand, is something that is flat-out magical or highly improbable to the point that it simply cannot be believed even if it is seen. Like my favorite advantage, super luck. Modifiers do what their name implies. They modify advantages. They come in two types, enhancements and limitations. Enhancements make it more effective, but cost more. Meanwhile, limitations make it less useful, but cost less. You can have several enhancements, limitations, as well as both on any advantage. And if you do so, you add all the modifier costs together to figure out the net modified cost, and then apply that to the cost of the advantage. So the formula is basically x times parentheses y, where x is the cost of your advantages, and y is the sum of all the modifier costs. Meaning, if you're applying a plus 30% enhancement and a minus 20% limitation, you add those two together to get plus 10%. Worth noting, most of the modifiers affect special attacks, denoted with a gun icon, meaning you can pretty safely ignore modifiers unless you're playing a superhero type game, or something else where characters have a lot of innate attacks. If your attributes are raw talent, skills are making specific uses of your talent. Each skill has a governing attribute which affects your base rating with it, as well as a difficulty which indicates how hard it is to learn. In game terms, difficulty raises the cost of getting the skill as well as what your starting rating for it will be, per the chart on page 170. Basically, when you buy a skill, your rating is based on the difficulty and the relevant attribute. After that, using a skill is just like using an attribute roll, 3d6 at or below your rating. This is the most basic explanation of skills, but it has a lot of other robust subsystems built into it that I'll cover in another video. GURPS is a kitchen sink game. It has everything, including the kitchen sink. So much that you'll drive yourself crazy if you try to completely master everything in a short amount of time. As I said earlier, it's best to treat GURPS as an encyclopedia. If GURPS has a splat book for what you want, check out that particular book and keep your core books handy to look things up that it'll no doubt refer to. Splat books are your friend. They give you tweaks and specific rules for a given genre. And don't try to use every rule imaginable. And if a particular circumstance isn't a major theme of the game you want to run, just improvise it instead of looking it up. That's largely what GURPS is, a collection of all kinds of rules for various kinds of scenarios. You don't need to use all of them, but they're present if you need or want them. It's not a game I'd personally run too often, because at the end of the day, every game run with GURPS is going to look really similar to one another, much like how most computer games made with the Unity engine are likely to have the same kind of idiosyncrasies. But on the flip side, because the underlying rules might be different from another game, GURPS still can fill a niche. Fantasy GURPS is going to play a whole lot different from Dungeons & Dragons. So, if you do have the time to devote to it, GURPS can be an interesting change of pace, especially if you find a game from another specific genre lacking. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting or helpful, feel free to give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to see other complex games get broken down into manageable pieces, consider subscribing as well. As always, read your rulebook for yourself. Guides on the internet may overlook things. With all that said, I am Aaron der Schädel, and I will see you all next time.